evening, everyone. What I'm going to be discussing today is something that has been contentious, the Jewishness of dwarves. As a Jewish scholar, I found it tremendously frustrating that something so clearly stated by the author and so obvious to Jews has been such a point of contention. There's a funny anecdote that relates to this situation about Edgar Allan Poe scholars, in which it's explained that no one in Poe circles discusses the orangutan in Murder at Rue Morgue, because no one can agree whether it's a racist or an anti-racist commentary. And so because fights start about it, no one ever talks about it. The Jewishness of dwarves, I think, is our orangutan, and at some personal risk, I think the can of worms is worth opening again. I'm glad I'm not the only person at this conference today to do that. And I want to make it very clear that, despite how this argument has been mischaracterized by its critics, no serious scholar, not myself nor anyone I will be citing, is calling Tolkien an anti-Semite. Far from it. Tolkien is exceptional for emphatically not being an anti-Semite, given his sphere of influence. What I'm drawing attention to here, as Brackmann did, is a systemic problem of anti-Semitism, which Tolkien inadvertently played into and then corrected for. The issue is systemic, not personal. In order to appreciate Tolkien's growth and the great value of his work to Jewish readers and to the Jewish community, we have to acknowledge and understand the systemic trap of anti-Semitism that Tolkien found himself in. What I hope to show you today is that Tolkien's dwarves were already Jewish-like during the writing of The Hobbit, and that the Jewishness of his dwarves is a really good thing, actually, all systemic problems considered. But it's going to be heavy before it gets happy, so buckle in. These are the scholars who have previously written on the topic. A lot of their conclusions are speculative, and the discussion has been contentious. I would love to go into more detail about it another time. For now, I'm going to only raise the following. Rateliff states that he believes that the dwarves were associated in part with Jews in Tolkien's mind as early as completing the first chapter of The Hobbit. He observes that there is a stark and sudden departure from the dwarves prior to the writing of The Hobbit, which he cannot account for. Hines also makes the same observation. He, like Vink, believes that the answer being an insertion of Jewishness in response to the Holocaust is inadequate due to its chronology. So I want to step away from these speculations because they are speculations and look at the facts afresh. Here's a timeline we'll be coming back to with every occasion of relevance in which Tolkien himself either talked about the dwarves in a way that relates to Jewishness or spoke about Jews in general. The most important for this discussion are: 1, in January 1938, he described the dwarves as not quite Scandinavian dwarves and that their naming was an editorial concession. It is already describing their language as private. In July 1938, we have the famous pair of letters regarding the potential publication of The Hobbit in Nazi Germany, in which Tolkien tells them to go hang. Everyone here knows it, it's important, but I don't need to rehash it. In September 1947, Tolkien returns to the point he made back in 1938 and directly references this as being like Jews for the first time. In 1954 and 1955, he repeated the same threads, with 1955 being the clearest. Then in 1965, we have the famous BBC interview in which he's very clear on the matter. It is important to note that all of these dates are after the publication of The Hobbit in September 1937. That said, the first mention of the dwarves as not being completely Scandinavian and the first mention of a theme that he later attributes to being Jewish-like occurs in 1938 in January, only 4 months after the publication. But this on its own is not sufficient evidence that the dwarves were already Jewish-like during the writing of The Hobbit, so we need to turn to the source material that influenced the dwarves. Everyone in this room, I assume, knows the dwarves pretty well. These are the traits that I want you to keep in mind while we go through the historical context. Number 8 is my own contribution, which is the use of contract law. It is important to this discussion that the dwarves provide Bilbo with a contract about his earnings, and that it was repaid in full, honoring the agreement. I'm not going to dwell on one because it's obvious and clearly stated. If we think about these traits, we can see how some of them are present only in the history of fictional dwarves, some of them are present only in fictional depictions of Jews, and some are present in both. So the checks here are for clear correlations, and the question marks could be extrapolated but aren't a clear one-to-one. Let's start with the dwarves before Tolkien. I won't delve too deeply into this because I think this audience knows this part pretty well, and because I'm just repeating Vink, Rateliff, and Hines here. According to Hines, the dwarves of the early writings and the dwarves of The Hobbit share the following characteristics, which they mainly got from Germanic mythology. They have a reputation for craftsmanship, an intimate relationship to treasure, a tendency toward vengefulness when crossed. Rateliff cites many examples of evil and greedy dwarves in the sagas, and Vink also draws attention to them living underground and being cunning, greedy, malevolent, etc. The Norse sagas also separate the dwarves as a species from humanity and elves, so we maybe can put that under racialized as other as well, maybe. Hines also notes that there may be some influences from 19th century authors like Morris, Lang, and the Brothers Grimm. The only one that I think is significant is that Grimm's dwarves tend to be teachers of lessons of reciprocity, so I will give that maybe to contract law. For the most part, Victorian dwarves seem to be more fairy creatures than anything else. The history of anti-Semitic caricatures is much longer and unfortunately much richer. What I'm going to do is specifically highlight the elements that are relevant in Tolkien's dwarves. The most important thing to come out of medieval anti-Semitism is the association of Jews with money, banking, money lending, and contracts. If anyone would like to know how this stereotype came about, definitely ask me some other time. It's fascinating, horrible, and really complicated. Julie Mell notes that in the 13th century, theologians shifted the focus of the sin in terms of usury from the person's intentions to the contract itself. So contract law was then added to the caricature of the Jewish usurer. This is how we end up with Shylock, who, much like the Nordic dwarves, demands reciprocity as vengeance in the form of an agreement. In the 19th century, racial anti-Semitism was born. Race was used not only to determine what someone looked like, though that was important, but also to predetermine one's character and moral values based on these physical qualities. Stephen Katz notes that unlike previous anti-Judaism, which allows for conversion, racial anti-Semitism was immutable and allowed no escape. This is what Brackmann is talking about when she says that any racialized worldview where Jews are considered biologically and fundamentally different from everyone else is in itself a form of anti-Semitism, as it legitimizes the ideas that would lead to the Holocaust. This is where the systemic racialization becomes a problem. Now, there is a long history of British discourse engaging in the so-called Jewish question, and strong air quotes, of how Jews ought or ought not to be incorporated into modern society. I'm going to note only a few here whom Tolkien was certainly familiar with. Edward Bulwer-Lytton in Layla or the Siege of Granada tells of Almamen, who Weingrad compares directly to Thorin. Almamen is a nationalist who wants to restore political sovereignty to his people. He's ambitious, possessed by a consuming hatred of and vengefulness resulting from long persecution. He is incredible on the battlefield, but his rage ultimately destroys him and he descends into madness. H. Rider Haggard and Andrew Lang, whom Tolkien was very familiar with, wrote a book in 1890 called The World's Desire, which I am not going to describe. It's really bad. It's up there with the name of Lovecraft's cat for the worst things I've ever heard. What it does do, though, is it presents Jews as greedy, callous, and outright evil. Haggard also wrote The Pearl Maiden, in which Jews are incapable of political sovereignty. Chesterton in 1920, also someone Tolkien was very familiar with, wrote a book called The New Jerusalem, which rejects the idea that Jewish assimilation or civic equality is even possible. The reason I'm going through all of this, and this is just the tip of the iceberg, is because it shows the discourse around Jews that is happening in 19th century literature and well into the 20th. There is an active discourse not only on the racialized othering of Jews, but the question of political sovereignty. And this is where I have to talk about Zionism as much as the timing is terrible. Zionism can be divided into before Israel and after Israel. What we're talking about now is before Israel. Zionism before Israel was born out of the same discourse of national identity in which Tolkien was working. Zionism comes out of the same intellectual movement as Grimm's fairy tales and the Kalevala. It was discussed in the 19th century, but it became a genuine rather than theoretical talking point in 1897 with the first Zionist Congress following a huge upsurge of anti-Semitic violence. The vague idea of the homeland sometime in the distant, maybe never future, suddenly became a much more pressing concern that could potentially be realized. This discourse was very active. This is a current political news item for him. This isn't some vague idea. This is a political reality in Tolkien's lifetime. Come on. So if we just look at this comparison on the slide, it seems questionable that Tolkien's dwarves are more Norse than Jewish, but I am leaving someone out. There is one 19th century creator who portrayed the dwarves a bit more in line with Tolkien and also drew from Norse sources and was a raging anti-Semite, and that's Wagner. Wagner and his relation to Tolkien's work is contentious, as is his anti-Semitism. Hines notes that it is Wagner who connects dwarves to smithcraft and treasure, much more so than the Nordic sources themselves. They are driven by resentment and vengefulness. They are greedy. They love gold and power. Hines notes that Wagner's negative view of dwarves may have added to his hostile view of them, thus coloring Tolkien's early views. In terms of anti-Semitism, Wagner. But there's one more thing that Wagner does. Eric Nelson notes that the entire premise of the ring cycle is emancipation from egoistic legalism, and that egoistic legalism is founded in Wagner's anti-Semitism. He specifically uses a word to describe the deals that Woden makes, which Nelson translates as quote-unquote Jewish bargain. So this is what it looks like after Wagner. What Wagner is doing here is very important. What I think is happening is that Wagner saw, as we can see here, that Norse dwarves happened completely by coincidence to vaguely resemble Jewish stereotypes and grafted it to fit his needs. He made the ring cycle a Norse story with no connection to the Jewish people, anti-Semitic, simply by making it fit his worldview. And I think perhaps Tolkien added Wagner to his cauldron of story without yet cluing into what Wagner had done and put himself into a bit of a trap. And so we come back to Tolkien. All of the previous references considered, we still have two major gaps. There is over a decade between The Hobbit and Tolkien's first direct reference to the Jewishness of dwarves, and there is the gap noted by Hein and Rateliff that something very major changed very suddenly in the dwarves that neither of them can account for. Rateliff postulates that the dwarves entered the mythology between 1917 and 1920 through the gnomish lexicon, with the word meaning dwarf-natured, i.e. mean avaricious. The 1926 sketch of the mythology and the 1930 Quenta are still repeating and emphasizing the highly negative early dwarves. According to Hines, they are at this point still skilled but inartistic, obsessed with treasure, greedy and opportunistic, possessing trade partners rather than friends, secretive, and ruthless when crossed. Then in late 1930, Tolkien begins writing The Hobbit, and they have changed drastically. They are honorable, sympathetic, artistic, and their vengeance is righteous, but they are still, very pointedly, not heroes. Hines also notes the dwarves' susceptibility to dragon sickness is a new feature in The Hobbit that isn't in the earlier mythology, and is emphasized in the final manuscript only. This would have been between December 1932 and January 1933. Hines notes that the change cannot be attributed to Norse influences because he wasn't really engaging in any material he hadn't read before. Hines rejects all of these potential Norse sources as the source of the change and states that reinterpretation of the dwarves in The Hobbit must have its source elsewhere. So the dwarves of The Hobbit are more sympathetic, more honorable, more gold-hungry than they ever were before. They are also now a diaspora community yearning for a homeland, which is not a Norse trait. So let's look elsewhere at what is going on in the world at the time. In January 1933, Hitler was elected Chancellor of Germany, and in March that year, the first concentration camp opened. In 1935, we have the Nuremberg race laws. In 1938, we have Kristallnacht and the beginning of the Kindertransport. But Nazism did not begin when Hitler took power. In 1920, the Nazi political party platform declared their desire to segregate Jews based on being non-Aryan. In 1929, when the Depression hit Germany, anti-Semitism surged. In 1932, Hitler's campaign speech was broadcast. As a scholar of German philology, I cannot believe Tolkien was not paying attention to the news in Germany well before the war. 1929 to 1932 were the percolating years of Nazism. The first direct reference we have that Tolkien likens the dwarves to Jews is in 1947, but he uses the same phrasing to describe cudgel in 1938, the same year as the letter in which he rejects a German publication. But there's more to add to this timeline. In 1917, the Balfour Declaration, in which Britain, who would have mandate over Palestine after the First World War, endorsed the creation of a Jewish homeland. In 1922, the League of Nations adopted the Balfour Declaration, and in 1948, the State of Israel was declared. I add these because it places the discourse in context. Is it an allegory? No, but it certainly is an influence. But we still have Hines and Rateliff's gap here in 1930. We still don't know exactly what happened, but we have a much clearer picture, both of Tolkien's writing process and the historical context. We also know that, in spite of the dwarves in The Hobbit being more positive than they were before, the gold sickness was added near the end of the writing process, and we know the dwarves are still not heroes. Hines rightfully notes that The Hobbit is not a complete change and that this should be seen as the beginning of the improvement process, and to that I completely agree. We should not view The Hobbit as a huge departure from previous dwarves, but as an intermediary stage, which was Brackmann's whole point. Gimli and further revisions thereafter really do tell of honorable, admirable, sympathetic dwarves who shed all of these negative qualities, who become more and more blatantly associated with Jewishness in this positive retconning. Because we know for a fact that Tolkien was not, at least by 1938, an anti-Semite. We also know for a fact that by 1947, he was actively associating dwarves and Jewishness. We can assume to some extent, based on almost identical phrasing, that this was already vaguely the case in 1938. And Rateliff believes that they were already Jewish-like at the start, given their diaspora yearning for a homeland. And given all these facts that we now know about the sphere of influence, it is extremely possible. So this is what I think happened. Tolkien wrote his dwarves as being Norse originally. He drew from Norse sources, including Wagner. Then, at some point in this timeline between late 1930 and 1938, I would argue 1930 given the details, but we can't know that for sure, Tolkien looked at his Norse dwarves and went, well, they're a bit Jewish, aren't they? That leap is the nugget of systemic anti-Semitism in this whole process that Vink actually proves better than Brackmann did. In Vink's own words, at some point, the idea occurred to him that his dwarves had some things in common with the Jews, and apparently, this notion held enough appeal to him for it to stick. It is actually more anti-Semitic to decide that the characters you've already made to be gold hungry and greedy should then resemble Jews. This is the implicit bias that Brackmann was addressing. This is a conscious choice being made as opposed to an accidental one. So one of two things happened. Either Tolkien went, well, they're already pretty Jewish, aren't they? Let's make them more Jewish, realized his error when the Nazis came knocking and actively corrected for it. Or he realized during the building up to the Holocaust that they could very easily be read this way and panicked. Either is possible. You could successfully argue both. But we can rightly assume that by the time the Nazis came knocking on his door, he knew what he had to do. When the Nazis want to translate your work, that is a grave problem. If Tolkien had not turned them away, and if the Nazis had gotten their hands on the Hobbit during the Second World War, we would be having a very different conversation about this book today. It would have, without a doubt, been used as anti-Semitic propaganda, just like Wagner's Ring Cycle was. It is, in my opinion, the most important choice he ever made for the future of his work and his legacy. It cannot be overstated how important that is. It is disingenuous to assume that Tolkien could not have possibly considered the dwarves as Jewish-like until 1947, given all the context, and it is in fact a disservice to both his intelligence and his morals. It is a good thing, and it is the action of a good man to realize a mistake and to actively work to correct it, to grow as a human being and to be on the right side of history. From Chaucer to Wagner to Lang, the sphere of influence set Tolkien up for failure. So all things considered, he did incredibly well. Based on all this information, it is entirely possible, and in fact probable, that based on the influences of Victorian anti-Semitism, Wagner's influence on dwarfish depictions, and the timeline of Nazi Germany, Tolkien had a realization that his dwarves could be read as anti-Semitic, and that was a problem, and accounted for it. Can we prove it without a shadow of a doubt? No. But you can't prove most social history without a shadow of a doubt. That is not how history works. You can only make speculations with substantial and probable correlations, and this is both substantial and probable. Now, the title of this paper includes the phrase Jewish joy. My original intention was to highlight where we go from here and how we engage with the text as is. The problem was that it was impossible to even broach the subject of Jewish joy in relation to the dwarves if we don't address the elephant in the room. We need to acknowledge a problem before we can begin to discuss reclamation and representation. Because if Gimli and the dwarves following the changes are representation, if we can see ourselves in them, and they are the same dwarves as the dwarves in The Hobbit, then we have to see ourselves in Thorin also, which is problematic. But the truth is that we do, and we can see ourselves in the dwarves, warts and stereotypes we are unfortunately used to, and all. Somewhat negative and complicated representation is still representation when the default for heroic fantasy is white, and that is so valuable and so worth holding on to. We know that the dwarves are Jewish-like intentionally, and we can claim the positive traits that Tolkien put forth as our own very easily. We can claim dwarves as our own happily and enthusiastically. They're ours, and they're us. It's no coincidence that when the Hobbit films came out, Jews across the spectrum of fanishness thought it was a Jewish story, and were jokingly calling it, and I am not kidding, Zionism the movie, because that's the story. And that has roots in early Zionism, pre-Israel Zionism, that Tolkien inserted into the text that didn't come from Norse sources. So it matters. It's messy, it's complicated, and it's not always clear, but it matters. I've put 3 quotes up on the slide here from different Jewish sources that I think are worth sitting with, but I want to end on a different note. What I like to do with this conversation is I like to link to the song To Life from Fiddler on the Roof. The QR code will lead to that video. If you want to have a moment and just smile, I recommend watching it. If you watch the scene and you think not only of Jews in troubled times, but also of the dwarves in their troubled times, I think you can get a glimpse of what dwarvish Jewish joy feels like. Thank you.
Right. Thanks very much, Mercury, for a thoroughly researched and very compelling paper presentation. I don't know if you can see in the chat, but there was a great deal of enthusiasm and indeed joy at your laying out of the timeline in such a thorough manner. We have a couple of questions in the Q&A. That I would love to, if you're up to fielding them. We've got a couple here. Our first is from Craig Franson, who says, I love that you're noting Lytton, Haggard, and Chesterton. Not sure of elements that correlate to Tolkien's dwarves, but I vaguely recall Haggard's she, also Khazâd's villain in anti-Semitic terms. And I was wondering if you'd like to elaborate on Haggard's role in the Q&A.
So I include Haggard because we know Tolkien read Haggard. We know that he was influenced by Haggard, at least she. But it would be insufficient to not note an important reference, especially when such an important reference is a raging anti-Semite. The anti-Semitic issues in She are actually quite similar to the book that shall not be named, which is just nasty and horrible. But I do think it would be insufficient to not mention Haggard, because Haggard is an influence on Tolkien. He read all of these sources, maybe not these specific books, but he knew these authors very well.
Thanks for that. Yeah, I think the subject of Haggard's influence or not on Tolkien is one that has been covered at some length in the scholarship. Cameron asks, this was a wonderful presentation. That's not a question, that's a statement. Do you have any thoughts on Zach Kramer's work, particularly his reading of the elves as Jewish, which we also heard a bit from Milan the Mushin this morning and Finrod the Mensch.
Yeah.
But yeah, do you have any thoughts on Zach Kramer's work?
Yeah, I unfortunately missed the earlier paper because I had to work to pay my bills. And I've been looking forward to watching it later. What I find really interesting about Kramer's work, and I think 99.9% of interpretations are valid. There is a small, very small percentage that I do not think are valid, but most of them are. And if you see yourself in representation somewhere, that is immensely valuable. Do I think Tolkien intended the elves to be Jewish-like? Maybe not, but he clearly was a Philo-Semite, which is a lover of Jewish things. He put them in the Númenóreans, he put them in the Dwarves, and I totally would understand him putting them in the elves as well. So if that was the case, I think Kramer is completely correct to read them that way. One thing I think about a lot with Kramer's work on the Jews and elves is Star Trek. I think about how in Star Trek we have Spock and we have the Ferengi. We have Vulcans and we have the Ferengi, and both of them are Jewish influenced. One is very, very positive and one is very, very negative. You can have both of these things. So you have the elves potentially, and you have Thorin, or Gimli and Thorin. Gimli is Spock, Thorin is the Ferengi in my brain.
Nice fandom crossing there. I'm sure some of our nerdier folks in the chat will enjoy that. And a reminder that if you have questions, please pop those in the Q&A. It's the easiest way for us to get them to Mercury. I thought there was a lot of just really lovely stuff in your talk, Mercury. I was appreciating the way in which you disintegrated conscious anti-Semitism from anti-Semitic contexts.
Yeah.
I think that's an important, being able to name the ways in which Tolkien, by living in a particular period and by being influenced by particular intellectual and artistic figures, may have reproduced those tropes without necessarily intentionally intending to. And if you wanted to expound on that particular distinction, which I thought you brought out quite well in your paper, as it pertains to Tolkien, I would be interested to hear.
Yeah, and I think this is what Brackmann was trying to do and kind of failed to do, unfortunately. I think her argument is very good, but a lot of her details are not correct, which Vink correctly points out. But the point is what matters. And it's this point of, if you are doing things systemically, systemic is a problem that is in the system. It is a problem that is in the way that we breathe, the way that we act, the way that we speak. It's the things that we don't realize we're doing. And you cannot control for the systemic problems. It's why people like myself, we say that we're anti-racists, not non-racists, because you're going to make mistakes. You're going to make mistakes because it's systemic and it's ingrained in the world that you live in. And Tolkien did an incredible job of pulling himself out of that systemic problem. Yes, he tripped. But in the grand scheme of things, it's so valuable that he saw that he tripped and went, oh God, no, not that, anything but that. And hit the eject button and went in the complete opposite direction. And so many authors don't do that. One of the authors I didn't list, there was one of the anti-Semitic authors that Weingrad points out was a direct reference on Lewis as well. And so I would be questionable to see Lewis's perspective and where they split on that. But I think it is a real act that we should be super proud of him for. We should be super proud of his ability to pull himself out of a systemic problem. And that is so valuable.
I really appreciate the perspective you bring to this. And I have another question in the chat. I think this may be a little bit too big to answer in the time that remains, but I do want to give voice to it because I think it's an important question, particularly in light of this question of anti-Semitism and racialization, which is, for this from Alex. And despite Tolkien's refusal to have The Hobbit published by Nazi-leaning publishers in 1937, Tolkien has been regarded as a sort of prophet and cultural reference of European far-right movements, the extreme right in particular, for decades. How can this be explained, in your opinion? Thank you for the interesting talk you have given. You have approximately 60 seconds in which to answer that question, Mercury. So I leave you to it.
Ask Robin Reed is my short answer to that question. Robin Reed or American Id. Those are the two places that you should look. It's a podcast called American Id, and I'm so sorry, you guys. I am forgetting your Craig and Danny. I'm forgetting your surnames at the moment, but they do American Id. That will tell you everything you need to know about the far right's grabbing of Tolkien. And Robin Reed is doing a lot of work on it. It is a real problem, and hopefully the work I'm doing is trying to counter that.